Good morning. Whew. Do you ever look at something and then it just reminds you of something that's funny? So this doesn't have anything to do with the sermon, and if you're in the back running control system, don't get concerned because I'm going backwards. But I remember as a kid singing this song. I mean like a kid, not like even a teenage kid, just kid, right? And it's when we were going to church at Hornbeak. And when we would sing, I mean, everybody sang it as well with my soul, right? And I remember as a kid, we're singing it as well with my soul. And just put yourself in a kid thought brain for just a second, okay? My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. And I was thinking, I didn't think we were supposed to be excited about sinning. But here, my sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. Now, I know there's a hyphen in there, but when you're a kid, you don't see a hyphen. And even if you're looking at the book, you don't know what a hyphen. Now, the bliss of the glorious thought goes with my sin, not in part, is nailed to the cross, right? So, but when I was a kid and I was singing that, my sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought, it took me a few years before I got that theologically right. I just wanted you to know that. We're singing that song a few minutes ago, and that thought pops in my head like from when I was, 8, 9, 10. I don't know how old I was when I was thinking that. But anyway, so if you're singing that song and you're singing, my sin, oh, the bliss of that glorious thought, and you're thinking, I don't know, we're supposed to be excited about sin. You're not. You're excited about the fact that it's been nailed to the cross. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I just wanted to share with you because I was chuckling as I was singing. Psalm 74. Psalm 74 is it's one of those psalms. It's a really great psalm. But Asaph is just going to ask questions that very honestly I'm not going to say we. Asaph is going to ask questions that very often I ask. And just to let you know where this sermon is going, the very question is, God, why don't you do something? Why don't you do something? What are you waiting on? And when you start reading Psalm 74, the Psalm of Asaph, and Psalm 74:1, you got a Bible, just open it to Psalm 74:1, or if you've got, we'll throw some of these up on the screen. But it says, a maskil of Asaph. Now, I want to talk about that for just a second, because a couple of weeks ago we talked about Asaph and who he was. He was a musician in the temple. We have the cymbals up there because he was the player of the cymbals. Those are probably finger cymbals, but, they could have had those big cymbals that you crash together too. I don't, they had both. I don't know which ones he used, but he was the cymbal player. And he wrote some songs. And we say psalm, and we make that a whole biblical kind of term, right? The Psalms of David. They're songs, okay? And I wish sometimes they had put the notes with the words. Like when we sing and we got the notes with the words, we know how the song's supposed to go. I wish sometimes when they had written the Psalms, they had put the music score in there so we'd know how to sing them. But we don't know that part. We just know the words of the song. So if you can come up with a tune, we'll sing one. All right? Maybe that could be our church challenge. Everybody come up with a tune to one of the Psalms of Asaph. Okay, that just came off the top of my head. Y'all just hang on to that. That may not go anywhere. All right, so how about Asaph? Well, Asaph in Psalm 74 is writing about an event that has happened that very honestly, Asaph wasn't alive when it happened. So how is this a psalm of Asaph? Well, you've got a couple of possibilities, okay? The one is, the event is the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. For example, in Psalm 74, he says, direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in the sanctuary. They in verse 7, they set your sanctuary on fire. They profaned the dwelling place of your name, bringing it down to the ground. They said to themselves, we will utterly subdue them. They burned all the meeting places of God in the land. So it seems to me that what he is dealing with is the destruction of the temple. And Asaph, if you look at the destruction of the temple, there are a couple of times in the text. Shishak, the king of Egypt, came and attacked Jerusalem during the days of Hezekiah, and he carried some things away from the temple. Now, I don't think that's what Asaph is writing about, because Hezekiah is back in the temple fairly quickly within his own lifetime. It seems like probably in a matter of weeks or maybe even days. And so it's hard to see how he would describe the temple in perpetual ruins if it was during the time of Shishak. So it's probably not that event. So then you have probably the next one that I think is the best one is the destruction of Babylon. The destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon. So that's probably what he's writing about. But Asaph, the person, is dead before that happened, unless he lived like a really, really long time, and we don't have any reference that he did. But what's probably happening here is you have a couple of possibilities, okay? And I'm going to give you all of them and tell you the one that I think is probably right. He could have written it in a figurative way, though, that the destruction of Jerusalem hadn't really happened, but that doesn't seem fairly likely. He could have written it as a prophecy. That's possible that he could have written as a prophecy foretelling something that was going to happen. Maybe. It could be that a descendant of Asaph wrote it because Psalms were being written by the descendants of Asaph. Even after they go back and rebuild the temple after it's destroyed here, that there's 127 singers of Asaph that are going to sing in the new temple that's constructed. So it's most likely that this Psalm of Asaph is written by someone who is one of Asaph's descendants. And he writes it about the destruction of Jerusalem. During the time of David or Solomon, when Asaph would have been alive, there wouldn't have been a destruction of Jerusalem there. So it's probably the Babylonian conquest, sometime after 587 BC. You got the 70 years of captivity in there. You remember all of this? You got the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, the 70 years of captivity before they go back to rebuild the temple with Ezra and Nehemiah. So probably in that time period is when he writes Psalm 74 as a descendant of Asaph. And he comes along and he asks the same questions that we would ask. There's kind of what the temple would have like. I couldn't find one after it was destroyed, by the way, so I had to put that one up there. Asaph asked the same questions we often ask. Why and how long? Now, there are times I start looking for something in my sermons and I waste an inordinate amount of time trying to find the thing that I want to show you. And I'm just telling you that because this is the time that I did it. Why have you rejected us forever, O God? Why does your anger smolder against the sheep of your pasture? I love verse 1. Very literally it says, why are your nostrils smoking? And I wanted to find a nostrils smoking image to put up there so I thought dragon, dragons have smoke coming out of their noses, right? I find me a dragon, a nostril smoking dragon, a smoke. But then I thought, and Jackie kind of reminded me too, well, you don't really want to put a picture of a dragon up there kind of representing God. Okay, yeah, that's probably not the best thing to do. And then, by the way, you just can't find one that looks any good at all. Okay, so I could not find, except for some cartoons thing, this idea of smoke coming out of the nostrils. Now, is somebody mad if smoke comes out of their nostrils? Is that a pretty mad image? You think about that. That's somebody he is upset for a reason. He's upset for a purpose. Why have you rejected us forever, O God? Why does the smoke come out of your nostrils? When you start thinking about anger, a lot of times in the Hebrew text, when it talks about anger, it'll talk about having flared nostrils. It's visual imagery. And when you think about God, and you think about this descendant of Asaph who's writing this psalm, and he is looking at the sanctuary, he is looking at the temple, he is looking at the holiest place that he knows, the holiest of holies, and it's been destroyed and ransacked and burned to the ground. Everything in it has been carried off into captivity. And it's like God has just looked at that place that is the holiest place, the holy of holies, and he said, I don't care about it anymore. That's what the writer of the psalm is kind of thinking in his head. God, why have you done that? Why have you allowed this to happen? Why have you rejected us? Why aren't you coming to our defense? Why aren't you standing up for us? Now, we know when we read through the Bible, it's because of their sin. They rejected God. They turned to idols. But have you ever sat at a spot in life and you've said, God, I am trying to do the right thing. Why will you not do something? Why will you not make some kind of stand for me? Why will you not let yourself be known? So why does your anger smolder? Why do your nostrils smoke against the sheep of your pasture? He asks questions like this. How long will the enemy mock you, O God, and the foe revile your name forever? How long will those who stand against you be allowed to speak? How long will your name be rejected? How long will you let your name be reviled? How long will you let people speak against your name? How long will you let people speak against you? When will you make them be silent? Do you ever ask questions like that? Do you ever look at our world and the way that our world is going and wonder, why, God, are you allowing things to happen? How long are you going to let this go on? You know, being a believer in Jesus in our world is not always easy, is it? There are a lot of people in our world who do not view us in a favorable light because we are believers in Jesus. Maybe they think we're old-fashioned. Maybe they think we're out of touch. Maybe they think we're holding on to antiquated morals and an antiquated way of thinking. Maybe we're just not enlightened and we don't see the things that are really going on in the world. I mean, we've been described as bigoted and foolish and unreasonable, narrow-minded, out of touch, intolerant, incompetent. Boy, the list could go on, couldn't it? How long will God let those people revile his name? And Asaph is looking at this destruction of the temple and saying, God, verse 10, why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the folds of your garment and destroy them. I mean, when Asaph is writing about his enemies, do you get the imagery? God, why have you got your hand inside your coat? Why do you leave it inside your garment? Why don't you take your hand, your right hand, why don't you take your right hand out of your coat and do something to them? And we sit and we look at our world, and those are questions, honestly, we probably asked sometime. God, how long are you going to let it go on like this? The way that people are turning away from you, how long will you put up with that? Why don't you do something about that? Why don't you act in some kind of way? Now, there's something interesting about Asaph. This writer of this psalm, whether it's Asaph or one of his descendants, he expected God to deliver. I want you to think about it a second. You write that, and you write it, that's a pretty simple statement, right? Asaph expected God to deliver. We write that statement and look at that and say, yeah, that's right, Brother Greg, just tell them all about that. But just think about that for just a second. When you offer a prayer to God, do you expect God to deliver? Do you expect God to act? Do you expect something to happen? Because I do. When I pray to God, I expect God is going to act. I expect something is going to happen. And sometimes when we're thinking about God and the way that God works in the world, I'm not sure everybody expects God to do something. But I expect God is going to do something. He writes things like this. Remember the people you purchased of old, the tribe of your inheritance, whom you redeemed, Mount Zion, where you dwelt. So remember the people you purchased, God. Remember where you dwelt, Mount Zion, which has been destroyed. Turn your steps toward these everlasting ruins, all the destruction the enemy has brought on the sanctuary. In other words, God, turn your steps. Come back here and revisit that. Rise up, O God, and defend your cause. Remember how fools mock you all day long. Do not ignore the clamor of your adversaries, the uproar of your enemies, which rise continually. He expects God to rise, to turn back, to make a statement, to interject his presence into a dark, dismal, situation. I mean, when you sit back and you read that Psalm of Asaph, in verse 8, when they said to themselves, we will utterly subdue them, and they burned all the meeting places of God in the land. So can you imagine, just for a moment, can you imagine a scenario where all of the meeting places to God in the land have been burned? Where it looks as if maybe God has abandoned his people? Because that's the kind of situation that Asaph is writing in. Now, God has this history of really dramatic rescue, doesn't he? I mean, just think about God. Rescue. Now, we don't do a poll out there, but if I were to ask you what are the most significant rescues that you may have found in the Bible, what would you think about God who rescues righteous people? You might think about Noah. You might think about how God, everybody's turned against God except Noah and his family, and God rescues Noah, right? Lets him build the ark and saves him through the ark and the waters of the flood. So the waters of the flood to some people were destruction, but to Noah and his family it was deliverance. You might think of the Exodus from Egypt, when God parted the Red Sea. I mean, wouldn't you like to have been there to see the parting of the Red Sea? I don't know if I would have been excited or scared. Because I'm thinking, knowing my mindset the whole time I'm walking down that dry path with water walled up on both sides, I would have been the one thinking, I hope he holds that long enough for me to get all the way through, because I'd be thinking, I wonder if he's going to shut that in on me. But you would think about that. If you thought about times that God came to the dramatic rescue of humanity, would you think about the cross? Yeah, I would think about the cross. What if you, like this descendant of Asaph, were writing in the law of one of those periods? So they were in captivity in Egypt 400 to 430 years. I don't know how long they were in slavery. They were shepherds first, but then they became slaves when the king rose up who didn't know Joseph. So for a period of that time, they were slaves. And let's just say they were slaves half the time, which was 200 years. Let's just throw a number out there and say 200 years. What if you were in that law where there wasn't a dramatic rescue? You're in the 200-year period. You would have been born a slave and died a slave. And God didn't rescue in your lifetime. God didn't bring them out of slavery. He didn't lead them out of Egypt. He didn't part the Red Sea. For that period of time, you were born and died a slave. You didn't see the dramatic rescue. What if you were in Asaph's time and you saw the destruction of Jerusalem and they were in captivity 70 years before they went back and rebuilt the temple the second time? But what if you lived during that time of captivity and rebellion against God and you saw Jerusalem fall, but you didn't get to see the rescue? You weren't there 70 years later when they went back to rebuild the temple and Cyrus set the people free and you could choose to go back. What if you were in one of the laws? Would your faith have remained strong? What if you look at our world and you say, why doesn't God do something in our world? How long is God going to allow godlessness to continue at the rate that it's continuing? What if we're living in one of the laws? Can your faith stay strong? Do you realize that God has a history of dramatic rescue? Psalm 74. Nathan read this at the beginning. It's amazing how God works like that, because I wanted to read this too. So you get to hear it twice, and that's good. Listen to Psalm 74:12. Yet God my King is from of old. Now, don't read the words too quick. How long has he been around? Does he have a beginning? No. Does he have an end? No. He is the one constant forever, is God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He was the constant before there was earth for us to live on, to be created to live on. And he will be God when the earth is gone. He is eternal. Working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the water. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him his food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day. Yours also is the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed the boundaries of all the earth. You have made summer and winter. Who is God? Is there anybody else like God? Asaph's writing, or the son of Asaph's writing this, and he says, God, I know. So even in his struggle, even asking how long, even asking why don't you take your hand out of your garment, the writer of this psalm knows that God is able to do what God needs to do. Which means often God's deliverance doesn't match our expectation. What happens when God acts in a way that we don't expect? Sometimes that can be for a really good thing, right? And sometimes it can be for a very troublesome time in life. What happens when God doesn't act the way that we think he ought to act? Can you stop in those moments and maintain your trust in God, knowing that God always works for his purpose? So I asked you a question a few minutes ago. I said, do you think your prayers make a difference? And I believe with all of my heart that they do. But God doesn't always act in the way that I expect him to act. He doesn't always do what I ask. You could just look at our own church family and know that. I have prayed for people who were sick and they became well. I've prayed for people who were sick and they didn't become well in a physical sense. They were rescued in a spiritual sense. Still God acting. And God acting in a mighty, powerful way. I've prayed for people who are going through certain things in their life and maybe their life turned around. Maybe I'm praying for another person who's undergoing a lot of different things in life and maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's decisions they've made. Maybe it's circumstances, a host of things. What I'm trying to explain to you is I trust in God and I trust in God's decisions. I trust in what God does, but God doesn't always do what I want. He doesn't always give me what I ask for. I love C.S. Lewis. He said, if God gave me everything I asked for, what a mess my life would be. And I just want to say amen to that. Yeah. Just think back in life of all of those things that you prayed and some of them that you prayed so hard for. And you think, boy, if it had happened like that, I would not be where I am now. And a whole bunch of my life would be incredibly different. And you just sit back. There was a country song about that years ago, wasn't it? Thank God for unanswered prayers or something. Just popped in my head. I don't know where that comes from. If God gave me everything I asked for, what a mess my life would be. Asaph is looking at the world, and Asaph knows this. God's purpose will be done. God's purpose will be finished. God's purpose will be completed. You see it beautifully in the life of Jesus. You see it beautifully in the life of Jesus when Jesus is hanging on the cross, and you remember what he said? It's finished. It's completed. It's done. When Peter writes in 2 Peter, he talks about this day which is called the day of the Lord. And he says, they will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. You ever looked at the world and think that? It's just all going to keep going on like it's going on, and it's not ever going to change. It's always going to be like this. Those people in 2 Peter chapter 3 that Peter is writing about, it says, man, the world's been going on like this from the beginning. It's just going to keep on going like this. And Peter writes in 2 Peter 3, no, there's going to be this thing called, it's a great theme in the Old Testament and the New Testament both. There's going to be a day called the day of the Lord. Okay, the day of the Lord is the day where God shows up and God does what God is going to do. The day of, we say it was the day of judgment, the day of vengeance, the day of reconciliation, the day that we get our reward. For some people, it's going to be the greatest day in the world, and for some people, it is going to be the worst day in the world. I just need you to know that the day of the Lord is real, even though you think the world is going on like it goes on now, and it'll just go on like this forever. And I'm just telling you, it won't go on like this forever. Now, will the day of the Lord come in my lifetime? I have no clue. I have no clue. Could today be the day of the Lord? What? Could. Could be tomorrow. Could be next week. Could be 100 years from now. Could be 1,000 years from now. I don't know when it's going to be. But it's going to be, isn't it? Because God's purpose is always completed. And sometimes as we get into this world and we see all of the stuff that's happening in this world and all the things that's going on around us, we just kind of wring our hands and say, God, how long are you going to let this happen? When are you going to step in and do something? And Asaph knows. The writer of Psalm 74 knows that God is going to step in and do something. And he does, doesn't he? I don't know how long after this psalm was written, but the temple was rebuilt. They go back, they worship again. After it's rebuilt, it's destroyed again. After it's destroyed again, it's rebuilt again. After it's rebuilt again, it's destroyed again. You know, the cool thing now is that God doesn't need a temple. Where is God's temple? It's sitting in these seats right here. This is God's temple. It's not going to be destroyed like that again. Now, it's not a physical place, it is a spiritual entity, which is the church. Satan destroyed the physical temple. What is he going to try to do to the spiritual temple? Same thing, right? He's going to try to destroy it. Are there going to be people who oppose the church? Yes. Are there going to be people who try to destroy the church? Yes. But God's purpose is that this church, his church, not Clarksville Highway, his church university, will always remain whole. God will always be caring for his temple. But like Asaph, sometimes we look at God's temple, the church, and we say, God, how long are you going to let them speak against us? How long are you going to let them make us the bad guys? How long are you going to let this world think that we don't have any idea what is going on when we are the only ones who hold the truth? And I look with Asaph and I say, I don't know how long. But I know one thing. My God will act. He always has, and he always will. Ooh, might I live in one of those laws? Might. I might. But I might not. But I might not. The question is, when the day of the Lord comes, when God comes to execute his judgment, when God comes to show everybody who is God, and every knee bows before the Son, the S-O-N, not the S-U-N, right? Will you be one of those who have held on faithfully to the promises of God? Never give up on God. If you need to respond in some way, we're going to ask you to do that while we